In this video, we are going to see something called Async Await. So Async Await is a modern syntax of promises. In fact, Async Await is not something new. It's just a wrapper around promises only. And this is the one which we are going to use from going forward from today. Why? Because whatever the syntax which promises gave us a syntax something like this: dot then and then dot catch dot and then finally. But actually we can so we saw that because of because of chaining of promises, the callback, the nested callback sort of thing is now a flat structure using chaining, right? But in fact still it is not something which is like as simple as synchronous code. When you write synchronous code, it is like pretty much straightforward, right? Not there is no callback or something, right? So what async await does is that it converts this syntax into something which is much more cleaner, even more cleaner than this also. And that structure will be something like this. So we will look at it step by step, but you can understand that what is happening is that whenever a promise is returned, so for example here you can see that we are getting a promise fetch URL, right? Now in order to get the response of this fetch URL, the only way is that we have to use dot then and pass a callback, and that callback gets the response. Async await simplifies that syntax. What it does is that just you put a word in front of a promise. So fetch URL gives a promise, right? So any promise, just you put a word called await in front of promise, then we will get the data rather than promise. So earlier we saw that, right? If let's say some const d is equal to directly this fetch thing is there, if we print that, then we will get a promise, right? If we console log that. Now if we do put a await in front of that promise, then now we get directly the resolved value rather than the promise. So if we don't put await, we get a promise. If we put a await in front of the promise, then we get the resolved value of that promise. Again, we have got the first resolved value from this fetch URL will be resp, right? Now resp response.json, this is again a promise, right? This is again a promise. Now if I don't put await, then this will be a promise again, right? Because we know that this thing is a promise. But if we put a await, then this thing is going to be the final resolved value of this thing, and final resolved value of this thing is what? This thing, data. So that data. So now you can see that this thing is much more cleaner. There's a modern syntax in of JavaScript, and we are going to use this only. And in fact nowadays most of the people are using this syntax only. But still you should know this syntax, because actually this is actually the native way in which everything is working. So this is also working internally like this only. In fact the modern syntax, if let's say your browser does not support, then what happens that some things like webpack or something, if you write a modern syntax, then they will try to convert your modern syntax to older syntax for support to let's say older browsers. Now this will be internally actually again converted to this only. So you can understand that this is just a sort of syntactic sugar on top of promises only. In fact we will see that everything around this is just a promise. So just understand that async await is not some new paradigm. It's just that it's basically just promise in new form, nothing else, right? So rather than promise dot then, I'm using await promise. So that's it. But this is also promise syntax only. And what is async, we will come back to it soon. Actually just directly using like this sometimes won't work, so we have to use something called async, which we'll see soon. So firstly let's see that, yeah, we know that let's say we have a URL which is this thing, and now and now let's say we are having a promise. That promise we are getting, and now we know that if we print p, then we are going to get a promise, right? Now here's what I'm claiming is that instead of directly getting printing p, let's get the data out of it, or response, what we were saying earlier, right? Then we can do something like await p, right? And then if we print response, then now we will get, so this thing is completely equivalent to, if we get p dot then, and then we are getting response, and then let's say we are printing resp, right? So inside the callback you are getting p dot then, and then you are giving a callback, and inside that callback you are getting that response. Here if you simply put await in front of promise, then directly you will get this thing directly here, right? Okay, now now let's try to run this. So looks like it is not running, right? So the reason is that await is only valid in async functions or top level bodies of modules. So you cannot use await directly like this. Actually most of the cases you have to use some function, okay? And some function, you just create any function, let's say foo, okay? And just put this inside that function, and then you call this function. You understood? Now if you try to run it again, then it is written that await is only valid in async functions. This is a normal function, okay? So in order to make a normal function async function, you just have to use async keyword in front of that function. Now it is fine. Just remember one thing, in any function, whenever you are using await, then that function should be async function, which means that function should be marked as async, okay? Because this is an asynchronous function, okay? Now let's try to run now, and now you can see that we are correctly getting that response, and this is the first level response, right? And we know that we can get again the JSON, which is actually the data from response.json, right? But again, this thing, if right now we will print, then again we will see that this thing is a promise, right? This thing is not data, this thing is basically a promise. So in order to convert that promise and get the resolved value, we simply, rather than putting then, we simply put await, and then you can see that we are getting that data, okay? So this syntax, as you can see, is much more cleaner, okay? So so first thing that we have to put await. Second thing is that we have to put it in some function, and that function, nowadays actually some browsers and in some Node.js package management systems, they are starting to support top level asyncs also. But for that you have to configure and do some setup and pass some experimental arguments. But the point is that the safest way, which is supported like throughout the spectrum, is simply put it in a function and make that async function. In any async function you can use await. If you don't mark as any function as async, then you cannot use await, then they will give you an error, okay? So this is the way in which it has to be done. Second thing is that this is just a function, right? This is just a function. So I can I can write that sort type of arrow function also. So const foo is equal to, right there. But now in arrow function, async is put here, okay? Because this is an expression, right? This is an expression which from here to here, this is an expression, right? And foo is a variable, and again you can call that, and the answer will be exactly the same. It's just that you have to put async here and the same thing below. So we have learned that normal function how to make it async, and arrow functions how to make it async, right? So this is the way. Next thing is that why are we even creating a so we, first of all, we are creating a function, right? And then we are calling that function. So again, is there a need to just create a variable? Rather, we can simply take this whole thing, right? And this is called there is a term for it which is called IIFE, immediately invoked function expressions. So this is a function which is anonymous function. We don't need to make give it some name, and that function is immediately created and immediately invoked. Okay, and such a function is called IIFE. Just no need to remember such terms, but just the point. This is just a fancy term, but the point is that you can understand that from here to here, this is an expression, right? And that expression is basically what? A function. You can write anything, right? You can write 3 plus 2 anything, but then you cannot call it. You cannot call it, right? Since this thing which we put in bracket is a function, and that's why we can call it. And if you want to prove it, then you can see simply says if I pass 100, then this 100 will be passed here. So if you see, let's say XYZ, right? And then you can try to print XYZ. And then you will see that 100 you are getting. Okay, so the point is that just I was showing you that again you have to put async here, right? And that IIFE syntax works for normal functions also, right? Even like not async await. But the point is that will not work here, because that IIFE syntax is fine, but this function also has to be made async. Okay, and exactly the same, let's say instead of this, let's say you want to use function syntax, then again you can use async function, and then it's a normal function, not an arrow function, right? And that is fine, and this is not needed. Just okay, so you can see that it is working fine. So so both of these are valid. Okay, so that is what is mentioned here, is that you can use anonymous function like this also in IIFE structure. Okay, so a couple of things. We have already discussed that if a function contains await, then it must be an async function. Okay, so for clarity, let's remove this for now. Okay, and just for clarity, so that it is easier to view, let's create a new function. So let's say something like get data. Okay, and we are creating this function, get data. Okay, and the point is that it is running fine. The point is that if a function contains await, it must be an async function. Since this function contains await, this function must be an async function, otherwise it will give error. Okay, now what is the meaning of async function? So let's comment everything. Let's say simply I have some function. Let's say const add, normal function which we have used earlier also, right? And let's say some a and b you are passing. Okay, and you are returning okay, so this is an arrow function, so yeah, a plus b, yeah. And let's say const answer is equal to, I'm adding and I'm getting the answer. Let's say 3 and 5 I'm adding, right? And I'm printing that answer. Okay, so the point which I am trying to make here is that once like just what is the difference between normal function and async function, which means that if we are running this, then we are getting 8. We are running this, we are getting 8. Okay, now if like earlier we are marking something by async, right? If we are marking it by async, what happens? That is what I'm trying to show. If I print, you see that actually I'm not getting 8. I'm getting a promise which is resolving to 8. You understand? So if you see here also, So you are getting a promise which is resolving to it. So this type of this thing is a promise. Okay, so which means that now my answer, this thing is not a number or something, it's a promise. Okay, and since it is a promise, I cannot simply print my answer like this, right? So right now it is like p, it's some promise, and then whatever we did earlier, that we can do here. So p dot then, and then I will get my answer, right? You can see that now we are getting 8, okay, directly, not a promise. So simply you understand that any function is there, we just, if we mark it as async, then that function does not return a value, it returns a promise. Means promise is also a value, but just I'm saying that if you intend to return something, then that thing will become a resolved value of that, not that particular value. So if you are returning, let's say here 20 or whatever, right, then this thing is 20, but p is a promise which resolves to 20. Okay, now what if we return promise from here? So let's say promise dot resolve, we'll see reject, but for now let's say resolve 100. What will this return? Now it's like p dot then, you remember, within p dot then, if you returned from here, let's say something, then in the next dot then, if you returned 5, then it became 5, but if you returned even a promise, then also the eventual value which was resolved, that is what the next chain of then brought that answer, right? In a similar manner, this async function should return promise. Now if you return a value, that is also wrapped into a promise. If you return a promise, then okay, promise is already a promise, so no need to wrap it. But the point is that if whatever you return, the final thing will always be a promise, and the final answer, which will be resolved, will always be the eventual resolved value. Here the eventual resolved value will be what? 100. So you can see that if I print, then I'll get 100. Okay, so so you can understand, right? Okay, next thing is that async function returns promise, and therefore it becomes asynchronous. So now we know that this is asynchronous function. So right now, for simplicity, let's return, I just wanted to show you that even you return a promise, then also, so whether you return 5, right, or you return promise dot resolve 5, in both cases, this is p is going to be a promise which resolves to 5. So that is what just I wanted to explain. Otherwise, for simplicity, let's see a plus b only. Now it becomes asynchronous, which means that what if earlier something was there, something like this was there, and then I printed and then I printed. So let's take an example. We saw an example with then, right? We saw example with them. Let's try an example with async await, because async means async already we used here. But let's say here also, rather than then, let's use some await. Okay, so let's say some function foo, and inside that function we are going to write these things, right? So rather than this, we can directly get the data by putting await. Okay, so data and await. Okay, so we are getting this, and then let's print this data. And what is the next first thing we have to do? We have to put async here, because this is a function which contains await. Okay, and then after that we simply call this function. Okay, now you will see that we are getting 8. Okay, we are getting 8, that is fine. Had this function not been async, so let's say this is not async function here, also there is no async await needed, because this is like directly. You understand? I just put it async and it directly returned promise, right? In fact, if I don't, then it will not return promise. It will directly return that value. That is fine. That is fine. But the point I'm trying to make, let's print A and let's print B. Okay. So, and let's print C. Okay. Let's do something like this: B, C, D. Okay. Now you can clearly see that this function is synchronous, which means that A, B, C, D, that is how it is going to be printed, right? Because there is no asynchronous operation. Now let's make this async. Now if I make this async, then I have to await for the answer. If I await for the answer, I have to make I have used await inside this function, so I have to make it async, right? That is fine. Now let's try to run the same thing. Okay. Now you're clearly seeing that this thing is working in the same way like a synchronous function, which was this is asynchronous code, but still it is behaving like synchronous code, and that is the beauty of it. Using await, you can write code, which is asynchronous but looks like synchronous. Okay. But in reality, if you see that like earlier, when it was synchronous, when this async was not there, then we did not add await, right? Then here also let's not add await, and let's see the behavior now. Now value will be obviously promised, that is fine, but you see that I have not got the data. I have not got the data, right? Until unless I put await, I don't get the data, right? So let's say const whatever xyz is equal to await data. Means right now data is not data, data is promise, right? And let's say e xyz. So now you can clearly see that in the synchronous case, my final data was available before D only, right? But in this case, before D, the final data is not available. It's just a promise. It's just a promise, and the final data is only available until when you await it, right? So that is the point which I'm trying to make, is that when a function becomes async, then it returns a promise, and therefore it looks like synchronous, but actually the whole thing becomes asynchronous. Okay. And an await should be followed by a promise. Okay. So yeah, so we saw here, right, all these things where we were trying to print the data, and we were getting 8. Okay, so let's print let's do a lot of things. So let's say this instead of this, let's say I write promise dot resolve 100. What it should print? This is a promise which resolves to 100. I have put await, so whatever is the final resolved value, which is 100, will be assigned to data, and that's why it will be 100, right? Okay, that is fine. What if, so I'm always saying that after await that it should be promise. In this case it is already a promise. In this case it is a function, but this function returns a promise. You understand? Returns a promise. So very well you can write something like this, that const p is equal to so after await you don't need to write a function or something. After await you are just writing a promise. It's just that the function returns a promise, and that's why I want to write some promise after await, and that's why directly I had written like that, right? But you can see that this also works. But for simplicity, why to create a new variable directly? This will also work. Not only that, if you are thinking that let's say my sum data 2 is equal to let's say this is data 1, and let's say data 2 is equal to 10, right? And then you are trying to print something like this. Let's say log data1 plus data2. And you can see that 10 plus 8, 18 is there, right? Now you might think that, yeah, I can write this like 10 here, that is fine, and this is also 18, but can I write this await thing, or this has to be a separate statement? No, you can write this also inline. You can very well write something like this, and this works. You don't need to create await in a separate line. You understand? So this thing also gives 18. Okay, so just put a bracket to clarify that this expression has to be evaluated, and since this expression is a like this add thing is returning a promise, that's why you should add await in order to get the actual resolved value, and then this will give you the final resolved value, and then whatever the resolved value, you know that is going to be some number, and then you put 10. So this will work fine, right? Okay, the thing which I was showing you earlier is that, yeah, if some data is there, then so this is one way where you are writing a function which returns a promise, or you can simply write some promise, that is fine. This is a way where yeah, I have created a promise, and again you can write something like this also. This is a second way, but then you can write something like this also. Same thing, but instead of this you could have created your own promise. So let's inline create my new promise, and resolve, and then resolve to 200. Understand? This whole thing is a promise. And what promise? The resolve function. So there are two arguments, resolve and reject, but I don't need reject, I just need to resolve, so I will not use the second argument, right? Resolve, and it immediately, as soon as the function is called, it immediately resolves to 200, right? Which means that this whole thing, you can test this also, right? You can test this also. So if I have something like this, then I know that p dot then, and then data, this will be 200, right? So that is what I'm saying, that we have already learned this syntax. We have already learned this syntax, that how to do that. So I'm just saying that in this syntax I'm just putting await in front, and this you don't need to put a bracket here, because the priority is already understood, that after await in fact then it is related to new. If new is there, then after new whatever is there, that is given priority. So so after await new promise, what you are doing, so basically what it is doing is that this whole promise which you just now created, or you could have created it in a separate variable p, and then you could have done p, and you could have done p is equal to, that is fine, right? But the point is that this is also giving me 200. So you are understanding that most of the time I am putting either some this function is async function, this function as this is async function, so implicitly it is giving promise. Here I am creating a promise, but that promise I'm not actually creating, it is like promise.resolve is like already created promise it is giving me. This is the place where I am creating a promise. So you are seeing consistently that after await there has to be some promise. Now the point is that, let's say I don't put a promise, I put, let's say, 500 or 400, anything. What happens? What do you think? Will there be some error? Turns out there is no error. Okay, so this also works fine. It's just that you it should not be like this, but even if you put await, means there is nothing to wait, I have already the final value, but you see that there is slight warning that await has no effect on this expression, because this is already a thing, but this triple dot, this slight thing is there, that you can remove it. Okay, so that is the thing. Okay, so await, after await there should be a promise, but something like this is also fine. That is what the point I wanted to make. Next, now we will create a example function of delay. Okay, now a function something like this we can create, where I'm creating a new promise, and that promise gets resolved after that many milliseconds. Okay, after that many milliseconds. So let's say there is a delay function. Delay function we pass the milliseconds, right? And we are returning a promise from this function, and that promise I don't need to pass much things, I just resolve. But resolve after, okay, so I need to resolve not immediately, but I need to resolve after some time. After what time? After ms time. And that ms time will be the second argument. The first argument will be where I am going to resolve this. Do you understand? So this delay function, when I call, so let's say I call it 100 or 1000, let's say. So 1000 means 1 second. 1 second, right? So 1 second, what is this whole thing? If you print this, we know that this thing will be a promise. You can clearly see that this is a promise. Now this promise is resolved when this promise is so as soon as this promise is created, this inner function will be triggered, and then it will be waiting for either calling of resolve or either calling of reject. But it will see that after ms is what, 1000, after 1000 milliseconds the resolve will be called, and resolve will be called, which means that this is now completed. Okay, so after this is now fulfilled. But this is not interesting, right? This is not much interesting, because just it is pending, and if you want to get the, what will you do? So p dot then, and inside p of the, we know that there is no data, so that will be undefined only. Just let's say I wanted to print hello, something like this. Then we can see that after 1 second hello will be printed. Yeah, but again this is like nested sort of thing, right? We wanted to get a sort of a feel of synchronous delay, which means that is, if let's say I am having a function, some function foo, and inside that let's say I am printing log a, right, bc, whatever. Now is there a way I can get a like sort of a like very easy delay between a and b, let's say, and that delay should be 1000. Now this will not work. Why? Because since this returns a promise, so it will not wait. So you can see that abc will be printed immediately. Once I call foo, abc will be printed immediately. Okay. Now I want a delay for it. Right? So what can I do? I can put await here, and then since await is there, so I have to mark the function as async. Now you see that after a delay is there in between b and c, and then you can put like delay between this also. So you can see that after 1 second a, b and c are printed. First a is printed immediately, then b, then c. Okay, so you can clearly see that using await, it is like very easy and looks like very synchronous code. So this is our function, and wherever we want delay, just we put this one liner. There's no then, and it's like not the delay will be applied inside then, and then our code will be nested and like sort of a skewed code. So this is like very much not only flat, it is very much synchronous looking. Okay. So this is what I was saying, is that you can create async function, and inside that you can await delay. Okay. So till now we discussed only about resolve. What about reject? But before we go to reject, actually one thing I forgot. When we just created async function, when we created async function, so let's say we had a normal some URL, right? We had some normal URL and this thing. Okay, and then what we were trying to do is that inside some IIFE we were trying to create an async function Okay, and inside that async function, we let's say did some const resp is equal to await fetch URL, whatever. And if we print resp, then or let's print directly await resp.json. That will also work fine, right? So you can see that we got the data, right? Let's remove the question, this final, this thing, semicolon from here. Let's see what happens. You can see that we are getting type error. Okay, so what is happening? What is happening actually is that it is like something like this. Let's say this thing is some string, right? We know that this, obviously this is a string, right? And after that we have not put semicolon. So JavaScript is thinking that are you trying to do something like bracket on this string, which means that it is thinking that are you trying to do something like this. Understand? You just put in next line, but are you trying to do something like this, which is not the case which you wanted, right? This is a string, and a string cannot be called as a function, and that is what you see the error. It is saying that this thing is not a function. Now why it is like important, because see sometimes like at many places you will see that you can just ignore semicolons, but this is the place, and there are many such places where you will see that a single semicolon mistake will make the code it will break the code. In fact, if you do a bit of googling, there are ways where like here like you missed the semicolon and you got the error, and you put the semicolon and you fix the error. But there are some scenarios where if you miss the semicolon, it will not be an error, it will be running perfectly fine, but it will run wrong. Now that is like much worse, right? So that's what I always say, that even if this is optional in JavaScript, semicolon is optional, have a habit of always putting semicolon. Just what is there, right? It's not a big deal, but it would not be a like much pain if you try to do something like that, because it will avoid you this sort of errors, especially for beginners. So if you are an expert and you are getting some error, then you can resolve it very quickly, right? But sometimes if an issue is coming and you are not aware of it, then it is going to be like a big problem. Okay, so try to handle that. Okay, so the final thing which we are going to discuss in async await is something called try catch block. Okay, now where this try catch was for synchronous code, right? For promises we had like dot catch, right, and dot finally. So what is this? So actually with async await we use normal try catch, and we can also use finally. Why? Let's discuss that why. See, let's say we are having this piece of code inside some function. For clarity, let's write some function. So let's say fetch data is equal to this function. Okay, and this function you are calling. Okay, sorry. So you have to call it from here. Yeah. So you are getting this data, right? Now what if there is some error? What if there is some error? So firstly let's make it simpler slightly. Const data is equal to await will also work, but anyways, because you know that await will resolve, and then second await will work on a constant, and constant working is fine. Okay, fine. The thing is that what if something goes wrong? If you see that let's say we change something, let's say QQ or something, then we know that this will give us an error, right? But again it gets uncaught, right? Why? Because there is no catch. There is no catch. Now where can we put that catch? Where can we put that catch? Try catch is fine, but let's not go in try catch direction right now. Simple promise dot catch. Where can we put that promise dot catch? You see, this whole thing also returns a promise. We discussed just now that async function returns a promise. So essentially, this thing is a promise. This thing is a promise, right? This thing is a promise. Now if this thing is a promise, then this thing is a promise, clearly seen, right? Now then we can apply p dot then on p dot catch, and we don't need p dot then because we are especially interested in just handling the error, right? So we can simply do something like this. You can see that now it is handled. Now it is we who are printing, it's not uncaught. Okay, now again no need of doing this p. We could have directly done directly on this also, so this would be also fine. Okay, because this thing returns a promise, and that promise dot catch I can do. Now again, so we are going back to that dot then dot catch syntax. Is there a way to avoid that? And turns out there is. When async await was designed, in the specification only it was mentioned that await will return the resolved value, and if there is any promise, if there is any error in this promise or some exception is thrown, then that will be handled like synchronous code. You can handle that, you understand? So you can properly use try catch like this, and you can do something like this, rather use error. Okay, so you understand, rather than doing this, in fact you can directly do something like this, and this will work fine. Okay, so when you are using async await, just put so that is a standard, right? Normal promises, if you are using then catch finally, then you use p dot then, right? P dot then and whatever. So the point is that when you are using normal promises, then you are using some promise dot then dot catch dot finally, and like that. If you are using async await syntax, then also you can use something like this, but then have one syntax always. So rather than this, we simply use try catch finally, and all these things will work. Okay, you understand that await converts your errors from promises to exceptions which can be caught in this catch. Yeah, so now we can see that if we are having a async await, then simply that error with whatever is coming here, that will be caught here. Okay, so that error is coming here. Okay, and this is just a handling of error. If there would have been no error, then if there would have been no error type code, yeah, then it would work perfectly fine. Okay, so yeah, and you can use finally and all everything. So the way to use to handle errors is this thing, right? So this is the final syntax which you will be using almost everywhere in JavaScript for promises, right? So slowly you have to just remember dot then dot catch, all those things, but this is the final thing, right? It's normal flat synchronous like code with await, and inside a function, that function will be async, and that will be wrapped in try catch, and it will be working simply like synchronous code. Okay, so this is the way which we will be going forward using, and most of the promises are done. Few things like there are some functions which are available on promises, like promise.all, promise.all settled. So those functions are used for coordinating with multiple promises. So those things are left, that we will see in next set of videos. Thanks a lot.